to another edition of the Atlantic CIL podcast. I'm here with one of my new friends that I met this year, Carolee. And Carolee, how do you say your last name?
Morano.
Morano,
Yeah.
Carolee Morano. And before, as we gotten to know each other, we know that we found out we had a lot in common. We both came from the independent living, the IL backgrounds. So Carolee, let's jump right into it. How did you get involved in independent living and disability advocacy?
Okay. So after a 14-year career in international banking, I had my daughter and I became an at-home mom for the first 6 years of her life. And I wound up volunteering for an organization, a nonprofit that did services for women and children primarily. And I fell in love with nonprofit mission work. And then I reached a point where I was looking to be employed full time. And my first full time job in human services was with an organization that served people with developmental disabilities. And and I was there for 8 years. So I really began to expand my own understanding and experiences of the needs, issues, barriers, challenges, rights, everything to do with people who had developmental disabilities, and many of them had multiple disabilities and who were living in group homes. So there were issues of, access, transportation, all of the issues that we typically associate with disabilities in general. And then it became time for me to move on, and I found my way into the CIL world. I was working for can I say the name of the CIL, Don?
Yes, you can. You can.
Okay, I was working for Dawn Center for Independent Living, and I will tell you, it was a wonderful job. I had an amazing boss, Carmela Slavinsky.
Who is amazing.
Yes, she is. And I became the independent living supervisor. So for the IL program, I attended meetings with the New Jersey CILs. I got to know the CIL community, completely fell in love, was absolutely fascinated about the history. And in fact, I was indoctrinated immediately with a wonderful presentation where I got to hear Ed Roberts speak and see all of the history of the CIL movement. And I really began to deeply appreciate the civil rights issues among people with disabilities. And again, that was a wonderful stint. And I did wind up changing employment. It really had to do with family and personal circumstances. I needed to be someplace closer to home. And I wound up again at a very big organization that serves people with developmental disabilities, also youth in the foster care system. So I continued that disabilities work. One of the cornerstones of my work throughout this career has been grant writing. But I also, and I've been involved in administrative functions like events and development things, event planning and marketing, communications, that aspect of the business, which gave me an insight into some of the government issues as well.
Yeah,
So,
well,
yes,
that's awesome. And we love the Dawn Center. And how long were you at Dawn? How many years?
I was there almost 5 years.
Wow, and you were also in international banking. I didn't know that. That's
14 years, yes.
that's
I
it.
started as a clerk typist and left as it was a $4 billion organization. I left as one of many, many assistant vice presidents. But like I said, I came in my early 20s as a clerk typist and had a very rewarding career. And that career has helped me greatly in nonprofit because there's not a tremendous amount of financial expertise in general. I'm not
No, I
every
agree.
organization, so I have been able to bring that to my work, especially in grants and development, which is the money.
Yes, which is important because you can't do any of the work without understanding the money. As we talk about on my podcast all the time. And now you're with the wonderful Mental Health Association in Atlantic County, and we are
Yes.
working on the Inclusive Healthy Communities Grant, which many of my listeners have heard about before, and where we're doing advocacy and teaching people how to do advocacy work. So talk about that. How did you get connected to the Mental Health Association, and how are you enjoying this grant work?
Well, it's amazing. And I'm just going to say, my connection was I had been receiving services. I had been ill for some time. I became unable to work. So I left my career in disability services much sooner than I thought. I was ill for some time. I began to recover, but in the meantime, I had been receiving services from the organization, and the services that I was most engaged in while I was not well were their UBW, United by Wellness groups, which now I am facilitating some groups, and that includes groups for the inclusive health communities uh, I'm sorry, civic action and engagement program. So that's how I got involved there, and that's been wonderful. And I am this. I've never worked or been involved with a Rutgers grant. I don't think I've ever made a Rutgers grant application, which is kind of funny since I've written about 250 grants. But I am sort of aware of some of their work in wanting to fund community health solutions, and so it's very much an honor to be doing this work, and to find out that I would be doing it with a SIL and have connection back into the SIL world, which is a very unique niche of
Yes.
services. It's been wonderful, and to my great joy, the people who are coming to the groups are engaging, are
Yeah.
engaging.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So we are really trying to, in our grant, get more people with disabilities involved in civic engagement, and we're teaching them advocacy skills and how to get involved, and democracy, how our government works. So really talk about, just briefly, people ask us all the time, how do I get involved in advocacy? And as somebody who's done a lot of this work, what would you tell them? What would you say to them?
I would say that many of the amenities that we enjoy now, that people take for granted, did not exist without advocacy. In the disability world, in the early 1800s, it just there was no understanding in the United States. There was just no understanding about disability, and to be very honest, I think people didn't really think of people with disabilities
As people.
people in the same way that we think of other people. And it was an enormously hard road of hard fought advocacy. And so those are the people who came before and made it possible for us to be where we are today. And yet there is so much undone. So we need advocates. By the same token, being engaged in the community, even if you're not engaged with advocacy per se, but maybe you want to be part of a coalition that helps keep the streets clean. It could be as simple as that, or beautifying parks, or it doesn't necessarily civic engagement doesn't necessarily have to be political or
That's
advocacy
correct.
or any of that, but the idea of being engaged in the community is certainly an important aspect to wellness. And so being able to encourage people to make new connections and maybe do a little volunteering and learn things about themselves that they didn't know is I think very important. And like I said, I'm surprised. It's a couple of the people who are in these groups I know from other groups, and I'm just heartwarmed and surprised to see them engage. So I have high hopes.
Yeah, and it's important to know, and we'll put the information of link to United by Wellness. Anybody across the state or even across the country can join these workshops and these groups. So if you're hearing about this, I know my podcast, I have had people from Alabama hear my podcast. So I know people can be like, oh, I'm not in New Jersey, but if you're interested in this topic, it's definitely worth coming. And I think what you said is really key because I think sometimes when folks talk about advocacy or when organizations like the Mental Health Association talk about advocacy, people right away go to like political, and a lot of people may not be comfortable with that. But like civic engagement could be attending a pride rally or starting a book group, or it doesn't have to be calling your congressman. Not that that's not a great thing to do. It just doesn't, if you're overwhelmed by this discussion, it doesn't have to be that. And I love what Carolee said about, she started this podcast by talking about the history and really the history of independent living, and it's all about advocacy and people getting involved. So talk about that. Talk a little about the history, if you don't mind, about
So,
really what stuck out to you and why it was so engaging.
I'm going to start by saying that to my fascination, going from, having worked in the SIL world and now working in the mental health world, there are two separate advocacy histories. And I'll just make a comment that I am very happy to see people both with physical and invisible disabilities starting to come together to increase their power. So with the disabilities history, people didn't even understand that people with disabilities are people with abilities who have a right to access everything that anybody in the community can access, and that's a constitutional right, and that was a hard fought right. And disabilities rights, it was part of the civil rights movement, but it sort of got excluded. And it wasn't until the 1990s when the ADA was passed that we finally had real legislation with teeth, not too sharp,
Yeah.
unfortunately. That happens with a lot of laws, but to really make sure that the rights of people with disabilities were protected. And one of the things that a film, it was a PBS production, I believe, and Lives That Matter. I'm trying to
Is it lives worth living? Is that it?
Lives Worth Living. And it really drove home the idea that many misinformed or uninformed people in the community did not even consider that people with disabilities saw themselves as people who were alive and had a life to live and had aspirations. And this film just, it really drove that home. I already had been in the field and developing a deep understanding of that and really appreciating that. But there was a scene in the film where there were protests arranged, and people were setting aside their canes and their wheelchairs and crawling up the White House steps. And it was a very visceral visual demonstration. We don't even have access to our government.
Right.
So I've wanted to be part of a movement that raises awareness to give people who deserve and intrinsically have the same rights as anybody else, and to make sure that those rights are recognized and honored, and that people with disabilities are not excluded.
Right, that's a great movie you reference. Also, another one is Crip Camp that has a lot of the great history that's in Netflix. So it encourages everyone to learn about this stuff. And you're right, the history really does capture you, and it can really make you just totally engrossed in this work because you understand the hard work that was done and the groundwork that was laid and the success that was had because the idea of even us having this discussion on a platform like Zoom is progress.
Yes.
If you know the history and know the stigma that used to be associated, that is still out there, but I would argue that there's been tremendous progress for people with disabilities, even though there's tons of work to be done. And what do you think some of that work to be done is, Carolee? What would you tell people? I know it's hard to think about
Oh,
because there's
oh,
so much, but what would you tell people if you can give them an idea?
well, I would tell people, and I actually in my work have been telling people, that we all have a spectrum of abilities, and they're all different. And whether you have a physical disability or an invisible disability or not, we all have strengths and weaknesses. And I think, one of the things is to make people understand that people with any kind of disability can be a very valuable asset to the employment community, and to, in general, the community, in some form of engagement as volunteers, just as people to be friends with and to meet, people in your churches or synagogues, whatever it might be, that you know every person brings value to a situation. And I would want especially people with disabilities to know that, because often stigma, there's also self stigma, and it's
Right.
partly a product of external stigma. And I want people to find their worth, and employers to understand that some of those unique abilities, they've been statistically proven. People with disabilities tend to have greater longevity, stay in their jobs longer. Unfortunately, that comes from a special gratitude for being given the chance to work, which
Right.
they should have had the right to in the first place.
Yes.
But and also I think people with disabilities are amazing problem solvers, because they've had to figure out how to get
Yeah.
around in a world that does not accommodate them
No, that was
at every
well put.
turn.
That was, yeah, I think those are great points. And really that getting over that ableism, which is a term which means disability discrimination, and the internalized ableism that I think every person with any type of disability goes through, just learning that there's nothing wrong with them, and that it's society that is needs to change, and that of course they have, you know, to do their part too and to live their lives the way they choose to. But it's, I'm reading a book, I'm listening to a book now called Disability Pride, and they talk about that process of sometimes, wanting to hide your disability and not being fully comfortable with it yet, if you can hide it. So you really have to learn as a person with a disability to overcome those things, which is totally unfair because nobody else without a disability has to do that. But it's about learning, teaching people, I think, society, that disability is a part of the human process and it's a part of human nature, and there's nothing wrong with it, which is why I always use the word disability. I don't like words like differently abled or anything like that, because disability is just a natural part of life. I mean, if you live long enough, you're going to have some form of disability eventually. So I always say you should be invested in this, not only for moral reasons, but for strategic life reasons as well. As
And it's
well.
not just yourself. It could be, and not that we wish this on anybody, but it could be your mother, your father, your spouse, your best friend, your child. Disability. There are proven statistics about this as well, and a high percentage of the population will experience disability at least for a period. And
Yes.
some, when they hit that point of experiences, are not going to turn back. It will become a permanent disability. So it does affect us all, and it does behoove us to understand that, so that we don't suddenly feel reduced when this very natural phenomenon
Right.
happens.
I
I've
mean,
come to the conclusion that anything that happens in nature is natural.
yes.
Anything that happens in nature is natural by definition. It's a no-brainer.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And 25% of the population has a disability. If somebody you love or you is going to have an experience with disability in your lifetime. So it's just so important. And now I'm going to jump to really talking to our decision makers and our elected leaders. And I know you have experience with that. And of course, people with disabilities, we want more to become those decision makers and elected leaders. And that's the purpose of our grants in the long term. So talk about that. Talk, because some people are so with disabilities are so intimidated by that. Talk about your experience with that and sort of how to go about. I know I always bring up calling a congressman, but people do think about that. How do I even talk to my decision maker that can have some effect on a policy that I'm concerned about?
Well, there are definitely a set of skills that make being involved in speaking to a legislator, whether it's your local town administrator or the president of the United States. Not that any of us are going to that level, but the point
Yeah.
is there's all levels of elected officials that we might speak to. And, so there's a basic set of skills, but there's also almost like a formula to how to get and keep a legislator or public official's attention, because they have a zillion people who want to speak to them about things that they're passionate about every day. So some of the skills that we've been teaching under the CAEI project, Civic Action and Engagement Initiative, are those wide ranges of skills. You have to have a little understanding of how government works. You have to have a little understanding of how to do research to follow a bill that's being considered to be passed as law. It might be as simple as, what to wear if you're meeting with a legislator, even on Zoom. You know, you might not
Yeah.
see what's on the bottom, but
Yeah.
the top should
Yeah.
look the way it should look.
Yes.
And I mean, even just engagement and eye contact, but also how to find your legislator, how to write a letter to your legislator. And I really think right now in a couple of our groups under this initiative, we've been talking about storytelling, which in the business world they call it the elevator speech, but
Yeah.
it's getting what you want to say down to 3 to 5 minutes, because at that point the legislator is done. So this is a difficult thing because we have stories and we have things that we're passionate about changing because we've been hurt by the system. And
Correct.
so we when we want to tell our stories, we want to tell the whole story so that they understand, but that formula does not work to get your foot in the door to get the legislators' attention. So that's a very important part of what we teach also. And also just helping people find local coalitions, local community meetings, anything that they might want to get engaged with in the community. We will help them find those connections and teach them how to find them for themselves as well.
Yeah, because that's a hard part too, and I think you really articulated it really well about how it's understandable that as a person with a disability, you want to tell your whole story from beginning to end because you think all the details are important. But and not that they're not important, but honestly, most legislators and most humans do not have that long of attention span. So you really want to get to your point quickly, tell your story, and then again you really want to end it with what you're started and end it with what you're asking for. Because legislators a lot of times do want to help, and decision makers a lot of times do want to help, but they don't like that feeling of when they're just being, you know, kind of told something, but not really a clear idea of what they can do to make it better or have some impact. So,
That's true. That is very important because many of us may feel that when we go in and tell our stories, they'll figure out what to do. And the reality is they're dealing with thousands, maybe tens and twenties of thousands of real issues that people have heartfelt concerns about and whose lives are impacted, and maybe in a very negative way. So they don't know every nuance of the existing laws. They certainly don't know every nuance of every issue. So you are actually bringing that to them, and because there are thousands, you have to be in a position where you're keeping their attention for that short time they have, and getting that point across by saying, what at the end you're explaining. For example, I'll use affordable housing as an example because we've been doing that. So off the disability thing, although it can relate, but we need more of. I have a grown daughter with 3 young children. She's a single mom. She is having trouble finding affordable housing. We need more. There are waiting lists, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the story. But what we really want, and we may not even know this initially when we're developing our storytelling for a legislator, what we really want is for them to ask to support a 15% increase in the county budget for affordable housing, for example.
Correct.
So that's the thing, is to identify something tangible that you can ask for that will help the situation. And before you even start your speech, you know that's what you're getting to. Because in the end, that's what the legislator is going to pay attention to. Is this something he could sink his teeth into?
Right. Because they want to, so you want to connect to them with your story, but then they want to know again what they want you to do with it. So do you want them to support, there's a housing development that's coming up for a vote. Please vote for it. What do you want them to do? Is, I think, a really important part. And we're also, we just finished up a workshop about the importance of building relationships and talk about that, because I know that some of our listeners and some of our people in the disability world, and I understand this, may be kind of disillusioned with the process and the political and decision-making process. So it can be very easy to go into these rooms and not want to get really frustrated with your legislator, and to not really want to build those relationships with the people who make decisions and also the other people in the community. But talk about the importance of that you need to, also know when to be diplomatic and to bring people to your side, even if you disagree with them on some things.
Absolutely. These are people who can help, and often you might have some differences, but who you might engage on a common ground, who have the power to make change. And so these are your allies. They may not be your best friends, but they can be very important allies in realizing these things that will make your life and the life of people who have experienced the barriers you have better. And I think a perfect example to drive home the idea that what you do today, you might not see the results. You might not even see it, but this conversation start as seeds. And the fact that there was tremendous advocacy and protesting and all kinds of civic actions that were taking place back in the 60s for the rights for people with disabilities, those seeds were planted. They did not see the results until finally the early 1990s, or actually the late 19, I forget the year.
Yep, 88, 1990. So yeah,
Yes.
you're
So
right.
so that's an example. And some of those people who were there, maybe they're 50 years old back in the 60s, maybe they weren't even here anymore when finally that law got passed. And we know that law isn't perfect, so the work isn't done. But everything you do is a potential seed. You can't give up. That if people had given up in the 60s because it didn't happen by the 70s, you
Yes.
would not have that legislation today.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And that's true for any successful piece of legislation that has benefited people. It takes decades and decades and decades, and you can't, you can get frustrated, but it's important not to give up and not to see your work as useless. And one of our participants did use that phrase, planting seeds. I mean, you can get very disillusioned, but you're planting seeds. And if you're advocating for more accessible housing, for affordable and accessible housing for people with disabilities in your neighborhood, for example, and you're gonna get pushback because they're gonna be, what about traffic? They can't afford this for crowd and that. But you're gonna, those people are members of the community too, so you're gonna find a way to work with them and to turn a lot of your opponents into allies. And there is a way to do that, and there is even a way to somebody could stay your opponent, but you establish a working relationship with them, and they respect you, and maybe they disagree with you about housing, but they are all for, you know, more accessible beach access, and you find a way to work on that issue with them instead. So, just always be kind to people. It doesn't mean you can't be strong and have your make your point, but building relationships is essential. And I know we're going to talk about this later in our workshops, but really talk about, and this work can be exhausting. Talk about the importance of self-care. You touched on mental health, and I think that's a good way to kind of end our discussion is, you know, people can get very, you know, disenchanted and disheartened by this work. So give people some tips on how to keep going.
So, just like people can have a physical disabilities, that is the word that we use. People can have invisible disabilities. Obviously, mental health is one of them, but all people have health, whether physical health, mental health, emotional health, all people have health. And in the mental health community, there's a concept of the 8 dimensions of wellness. I actually brought it into a curricula for the CIL that I was working at because they're not really separated. In order to have whole wellness, we need to have our best wellness in mind, body, and spirit. So that means that self-care becomes extremely important. And it can be difficult to do this, especially in a world that treats that has this concept of special needs as though someone who is in a workplace and might need some downtime because stresses are high. I mean, everybody has that. They take days off, they take vacations. It's not different for a person with disabilities. So we have to understand that we should not be ashamed to ask for what we need and to take what we need, and to know when we've pushed ourselves too far. In the mental health community, one of the things that has emerged as a tool and a movement is something called a RAP plan, a wellness recovery and action plan. And in that plan, you very basically identify, what do I look like and sound like and do when I'm well? What are the signs? How does that change when I might be sliding or sinking or not doing well? And then you write down, what are the steps I need to take at that point? And then there's a crisis plan, that if it does emerge to a crisis level, what should be happening, what you want in your life if you are not able to articulate at that point in time what your wishes are. So it's a plan. And frankly, I think everybody should have one, not just people with a mental health or any other disability. We all need to know when we are having the signs of pushing over the limit, and need to keep ourselves well, because that's the only way we get to keep doing what we do.
Yeah, I think bringing up RAP, the Wellness Action Recovery Plan, is a great idea. And send me some information. I'll put that in the link. I'll put some so people can look into that because you're right. People need to really do what they can to take care of themselves. And I know it's easier said than done. And you know, we've really been through a lot as a society in recent years with the pandemic. Like I always think about the trauma we just casually all went through and lived our lives. And there's still lingering effects of that. And being
Oh,
with a disability, it can be even tougher. And I love what you said about how we need to, the term special needs drives me it triggers me in a lot of ways
yeah.
because we're not asking for anything special. We're not asking for anything that any other human doesn't need. By the way, taking breaks is good because it helps you be more productive. Like,
Yes.
this whole concept that you need to go and go and go until you're physically and mentally drained and ill. Just I see us getting away from this society, but we need to continue to get away from because it's not healthy and it's also not productive. So I think that was a great way to close it. We're gonna end here and thank you so much, Carolee. If you have anything else you want to promote or say, please wrap us up here. And this was a great discussion. I'm so glad you found the Mental Health Association. I was so happy when I heard you worked at them because I'm like, oh, another still person, another
Yes.
person. Because as you
It's a
know,
good bridge for the
and,
project.
yeah, well, and it's just like you said, cell services are so different than all other disability services, and it is such a
That's
such a great group of people we have here in New
the
Jersey.
Carmela used to call the sills the best kept secret.
we
because
really
people
are.
don't hear about them. There's not enough funding for them, so there's not tons of money to go around
Right. They're
promoting and putting up
right.
billboards and
Right.
whatever. So
I
and
always
they're
say,
so
and now we're gonna get off into a thing. I always say I love Ed Roberts, but I would probably would rename this because the name is sometimes confusing. People think we're assisted living or
yes.
people live here and nobody lives at your cell. We're resource centers, so
No,
it's
the sills are actually about how to get people out of an institutional
exactly,
setting and
exactly.
living in an independent life with whatever sports they need in the community. So there is that. I won't call it a misnomer, but I'll say it might be somewhat misleading because
Yes,
people
it's
tend to hear
confusing.
that residential thing
It's
when they
confusing.
hear center.
Yep. So, like I said, if you have any other thoughts, please wrap us up, and then I will see you at our next IHC meeting. And if anybody wants to come, we're gonna have information in the link. I won't give the dates and times because I don't want them to be on this episode and then we change it. So please just follow the links.
So the last thing I wanted to add is that idea that I hope that each one of us finds a way to find our self-stigma and cure that. And an example I want to give is everybody does have workplace accommodations. People don't necessarily recognize that. But if I was 4'9" and I was working in a grocery store and I had to stock a top shelf, I would need help. I would need an accommodation. I would need my employer to understand that I can't stock the shelves. So I need an accommodation that I team up with another employee and maybe I do a piece of their job instead because they have to do this piece of what would have been my job otherwise. So we're all just like everyone else and don't let anybody else ever make you think otherwise.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And I'll just end by saying I think the one of the most frustrating parts of having any type of disability is that when you ask for help, it can turn oh, they need help. It turns into a thing. But people without disabilities get help and ask for help all the time, and you help them and they help you. And but yet when you have a disability, it sometimes gets turned into like, oh, but like I said, it goes back to that this is a special need and this is something different. So we really need to again get away from that and just understand that we're all connected and that disability is just a part of life. So thank you all for joining
Thank
us,
you.
and thank you, Carolee, for a great episode of the Atlantic CIL podcast. I didn't change the name, I promise. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.